Now, in this episode of The Innocence of CO2, I'm going to show you a lot of my own research. But before I do that, I've got to do a bit of a link from the previous episodes. Now, I'm going to show you a graph now. It's the longest temperature record in the world. It's called the Central England Temperature Record. It's based on a triangle of stations in the middle of the UK, and it dates back to 1659. Now, if you put this temperature graph on a normal thermometer scale, you'll see it something like this. Well, dating back some 365 years to 1659, and if you waited that long, you'd see your normal thermometer scale, your normal scale on a thermometer, change by this much over that time. In fact, just over 1 degree. So you wouldn't be too alarmed. You wouldn't even hardly notice it on a normal scale. But let's now look at the same temperature record, not averaged out like this, but with the variations in it, the natural variations. Well, with the natural variations, you can see this period here, from 1730 to 1740, it got pretty hot. Just like at the level there, it's almost 1 degree centigrade more than the surroundings, and very near to what it is today. And as we go on, you'll see these different peaks. I'll just put a line through them so you can compare them to today. So we were coming out of the little ice age, and that warming to come out of that little ice age started well before the Industrial Revolution. It was started in the late 1600s, 150 years or so before the Industrial Revolution. And that warming must have been pretty well natural. And as we came out of that, you can see here, we've just recovered and added, since the little ice age, we've added about 3 degrees, because it was about -2 at times there. And we've come out of that and recovered. It should also be noted that the past showed extreme ranges of temperature compared to the much narrower band we have today, less extreme weather. The reason is very simple. The warming always occurs from the poles inwards. The temperatures of the tropics don't change that much. So if you have less difference between the tropics and the poles, you have less extreme weather. As you warm, you get less extreme weather. The exact opposite of the alarmists, of course. So what I've done in this prelude section is give you some idea of the small changes. Now, to link this to the previous episodes, the ideal gas formula, it's quite good at giving you the temperature of a planet. I've explained that in the first 2 episodes. However, what it does not do is actually does not prove that there is no greenhouse gases, because there are. What the gas law does is simply measure the temperature approximately without reference to greenhouse gases. But actually the greenhouse gases, the effect of them is already built into what you're measuring, because the greenhouse gases can actually change things like the pressure used in the ideal gas law. So I've just done that as perspective to give you an idea of how these are small changes. They are not massive. So what is this episode about in this pretty long prologue? Well, this episode is about taking the period from 1900 to 2020 and proving beyond reasonable doubt that the alarmism they've been using on trends in that, on little bumps in that at 10 years of warming and 20 years and all this, is rubbish. That it can be totally accounted for naturally. But what it does not do in this episode, at this point, is even deal with the greenhouse gas. So it takes out the rise in temperature between 1900 and 2020. It takes that out. It doesn't discuss it. So it doesn't disprove the greenhouse gas. What it does is show you how they've misused the alarmism, and it explains the warming period of the 1930s, which was worldwide a decade of heat waves. It shows you the cooling between the 40s and the 70s that caused the Ice Age coming scare, and then the warming from 1980s, and then the steadying out after 2000. All of that is explained by my research in this. And I've done my very best. I've done a number of papers to get to it. I'm only going to link a few here to get to the results. And you can see the path I've gone on in this. And I also have following research papers based on it, which I'll be using. So this is my own work. And I hope when you understand this, you'll understand how the alarmists have totally misused information. I'm sorry for the slip-ups in my speech sometimes. I do these live, no script. Let's get on with the show. Until now, I've shown you in episode 1 that it's possible to reasonably measure the temperature of a planet using the gas laws. But in actual fact, when you're doing that, you're just measuring what's there. And what's there does include the greenhouse effect. Yes, it does. And therefore, what we're going to do now is move over to Earth and some of my own work on this. And we're going to try and I'm going to try and demonstrate to you the effect of CO2. It's negligible. But don't think there's not a greenhouse effect, because it's the energy from the sun, in effect, putting energy into the molecules like CO2 and in particular water vapor that keep the atmosphere up there, keep it vibrating. That is the greenhouse effect, and that reflects heat and really reflects heat back to Earth and warms the Earth. Without the greenhouse effect, you can go on, there's all sorts of arguments on this, but if you take it as a straight calculation, we'd lose about 15 degrees centigrade off the temperatures, so it'd be a pretty cold planet, as it were. And so the argument really on my side of the realism argument is not that there's no greenhouse effect. It is that it's not CO2 that's driving it, and the part that CO2 plays is relatively minor. And so what I'm going to do now is move on to some of my own work. You're going to see some of my own work here now that demonstrates that very clearly. Now, this work is based on the oceans. The oceans on Earth, and we're only going to deal with Earth now, not get carried away with other planets. The oceans on Earth hold 1,000 times or so more heat than the atmosphere does, and actually over 20,000 times more heat than the land. So the oceans control the heat on Earth. And the reason is very simple. In a nutshell, I'll be going into it, but in a nutshell, the radiation coming into the oceans, the albedo, the reflection of the oceans is low, and it's absorbed a lot of the shortwave energy. And not only that, the oceans are 71% of the Earth. Actually, water, 73% if you count the lakes. But just oceans and seas are 71% of the Earth. And all this has got this extra absorption capacity. And of course, it's huge. The amount of water there is huge with all that depth. And over the millennia, it's stored an incredible amount of heat. And that is what we're going to talk about here, because what I'm going to do in a series of 3 papers is explain explain the movement of the temperatures since 1850, since the Industrial Revolution, right up to 2024. That's what we're going to attempt to do in these papers. Now, I'm certainly open to criticism on these papers, but I'm going to explain them in this video, and the video is important to watch with the papers. All the papers are going to be listed below this and will be on Substack, and you can reference them, both in a layman's version and in a, if you like, a more scientific notation version. So here we go. So first of all, let's just examine those oceans and just let's understand, or begin to understand, how we live by the pulse of the oceans. On various timescales, from a few years right up to 70 years or more, they warm up and cool down to add heat to the atmosphere and take heat away from the atmosphere. This one is the Atlantic one, and right from the tropics up to the Arctic, it warms and cools on about a 70-year cycle. But the Atlantic is by no means alone. Over here in the Pacific, there is the Pacific Decadal Oscillation, and that is quite apart from the El Nino and La Nina. It warms up and cools down on a shorter cycle of 20 to 30 years. It varies. While similar to the El Nino and La Nina cycles, it is not the same. It is much larger. The El Nino cycles, La Nina cycles, vary between 2 and 7 years. They're much more sporadic. Now, even the extremely alarmist and, frankly, in my opinion, corrupt Met Office in the UK accepts that the Atlantic multidecadal oscillation changes the temperatures and gives us warm and cool periods. It also accepts the same for the Pacific decadal oscillation. These ocean patterns are now well observed, if not well understood, and people have been able to extend them back using various methods right the way to the 1800s. But the Atlantic and the Pacific Oceans not alone. The Indian Ocean has a more peculiar one called the Indian Ocean Dipole. It's this oceanic system, the dipole, that can cause floods in places like Kuwait. And instead of blaming climate change, all they have to do is look at the oceans. But back to the point, this is an interesting one, the dipole, and this is how it operates. One side of it, like the east in this case, can be warm, whilst the other side is cold, and it switches. It has three phases: a neutral, positive, and negative, with each phase occurring every 3 to 5 years. Now, I'm not here to teach you all about these cycles. You can look them up yourselves, they're well documented. What I am here to do is ask you, what is the effect of all of these? All of these occurring at different frequencies. All of these occurring with the sun cycles as well, the 11-year sun cycle. And so what I've done in a paper, the details of which are linked below this video, is simply combine all of these together. And to that, I've added El Nino and La Nina, plus the sunspot cycle index, to give one overall index each year, because some of them counter each other, some of them add on to each other. What is the net effect of all these? Well, all merged together, I'm calling it the Ocean Pulse Merged Index. But what matters is how much weight we give to each element. So how much weight do we give, for example, to the AMO, the Atlantic one, compared to the PDO, the Pacific one? Well, the analysis of the weighting of these different factors is detailed in the paper I've written, the link to which is below this video. And the result of that work is this pie chart, which gives the relative weight of each of these factors that are blended into the overall factor for that year. And when you put it all together, you get this graph. And this is quite interesting. So above the line is when it's warming, the oceans are warming the Earth, and below the line are when it's cooling. So I'll just colour those in now. So we have the years across the bottom there, and the index up the side there on the y-axis. And the zero line you can see, above which, as I've stated, is when the oceans are giving off heat, and below that which is when the oceans are absorbing heat. And I've, of course, also allowed a little bit for the sun cycles when that's low and that's high. Now, at this point, we were coming in from the Little Ice Age, and 1840s or so was the last time the Thames froze over. Now, I just want to stop this scientific explanation for a moment and give you a common sense point here, and it's a very important point. The alarmists tell us that mankind totally is responsible, anthropogenic warming is totally responsible for the rise in temperatures from 1850 until today. That's what they say. And they bemoan that fact. But had we not, if they were right, by the way, with mankind to save the situation, because in their world they'd stay in 1850, they'd stay with the Thames frozen over, they'd stay with mass starvation, with real record crop failures, with record storms and record droughts, because that's what the situation was back then. And that's what they want to stay in? I mean, this is bonkers. The idea that we came down into Little Ice Age and we should stay there because of some silly bonkers idea called net zero is bonkers. Anyway, I just thought I'd intervene to tell you that, because on that point alone, the whole alarmist agenda goes, because that's what they're asking for. Let's go back to the Thames frozen over. Let's go back to mass starvation. Let's go back to tiny crop yields that can't support the world population. That's what they're seeking. Well, let's continue with the scientific path. So we're coming in for a long-term cold period until about 1920. This warm decade, covering the 1930s, of course was famous for its heat. There was the Dust Bowl in America, but in actual fact heat waves were common worldwide in both hemispheres. So it was a warm period. The 1940 to 1979 period was a relatively cool period. And in fact, so worried were they in the 1970s that they started to forecast an ice age coming scare. But not to worry, our index came to the rescue with this big huge amount of extra heat being pumped into the atmosphere. And the global warming you will fry scare started big time. What is interesting here is that the area above, that's the warm contribution, is a 70% of the total, but the area below is just 30% when it cooled the Earth. So the net effect of this, there's been twice as much warming, about twice as much warming as there has been cooling. And that would lead to indication that in this time, in this 120 years, the oceans have given off more heat than they've taken in. Right? And that is a pointer. No more than that at this stage, but this comes into being something of importance later. Now at this point, I wanted to compare the index graph here to the actual temperatures measured in that period, but I have a problem. The Hadcrut data, which is more or less the universally accepted data, and the alarmists provide that, and the Hadcrut data I think is corrupted by the urban heat island effect quite a lot. So what I've done is this. There's the growth in the temperature, and don't forget we've had bumps in it, the 30s, the cooling, the warming. I've explained that so far. I've explained the bumps, but I haven't quantified them. So what I've got to do with the Hadley temperature, which I believe is corrupted in its trend because of its corruption with urban heat islands, of cities and areas have expanded and the temperature gauges have stayed in the same place. What I've done is detrend it. So I've taken all that rise out and just looked at the variation in temperatures about that. So we're looking at the variation in temperatures, in effect, about a zero line from what's been recorded, right? And that does away with whether it's greenhouse or not. We're not concerned at the moment with what causes that. We have simply leveled it off, and we're going to look at the variations the temperature gives us from the Hadcrut data. And to do that, I'm going to simplify this graph now. And now you can have a look at what that data is from the Hadcrut data. And here it is. So this is what I like to call the ocean pulse data, the merge ocean pulse data that I've been dealing with. And now let's superimpose on that the Hadcrut temperature data. And there we have it, the variations around the trend from the Hadcrut official records against the index I've created. And the correlation is incredible. And what this shows without any doubt at all is that the warming period of the 30s and the cooling of the 40s, 50s, 60s up to the 70s and then the warming of the 80s were all down to the variation in what the oceans, with a little bit of contribution from solar, that variation in that, all of that was basically ocean based. We live by the pulse of the oceans. And amazingly, the correlation between the temperature and my index is 0.944, which means it has a variation. It's accounting for 84% of the variation of the temperature is down to my index. 84%. And it clearly shows what causes these trends. And of course, knowing that, we then realize that the warming of the 80s and the big alarmism was caused by the oceans with a bit more solar. That's what it was caused by. It wasn't caused by CO2. And don't forget, when we got to 2000, there was what's known as the pause. The increased warming suddenly seemed to stop. And there it is there. Everything here now begins to make sense. But so far, we've detrended the temperature. And so all we've looked for, I repeat, is the variation about the trend, which we fully accounted for here. But we need to really get involved with the trend, the actual underlying trend, which you could still say is down to man-made anthropogenic warming. But we're going to have to examine that. But clearly, the CO2 idea now has got a problem when you can show it was the oceans and this index that caused this pattern of weather that the alarmists used to scare you. Okay, well, that first paper has really demonstrated the patterns of the last 120 years, really. And it's really demonstrated they're down to natural variability. And there's this underlying growth to deal with. Now, this paper is just the first of a whole series of papers I've done, and they're all my own work. And but we will be progressing now quite quickly through some of them because I've already done the work, so I've just got to make the videos. And it gets quite exciting. And we end up actually with correlation factors almost perfect at 0.97 and so on in the future. But what we have to take into account to get a more precise thing is clouds. And so we'll be doing that next and be going on to other things. And then this work will expand to show you how it affects the Arctic sea ice extent, for example, and other factors. So it's really a journey of discovery with me, and this time based on my own work rather than reporting other people's work, as it were. And so I find this quite exciting. I won't be showing you all the papers because some of the papers I do are just steps towards understanding and learning what I'm trying to get to the bottom of, which is the truth, that's all. Now, I'm more than happy for people to criticise. In fact, I really want people to criticise my paper, and I will answer. I will answer anyone who does any proper criticism of the paper. That's what science is about. In fact, that's a compliment, really, if people take the trouble to read it and say, but, that's great. I think it's pretty conclusive as a paper, as anyone's can be. Normally where we're accounting for 80-odd% of the variation. So far, we get up to 90-odd% soon. And so we're doing it to that level where most climate things are 60% or 50% or 40%. So it's quite exciting, the path we're on. And I like you to join me on this path. Now, I'm not doing this for viewing numbers because the work I'm doing now doesn't get viewing numbers. I'm doing it because I enjoy it and because it's me bringing together my experience in this and sticking with the science and looking at it afresh, as it were. So there we are. And I look forward to meeting you on the next episode. Thank you for watching.